So in this video, we are going to be talking about meiosis. It's just going to be a big, broad picture of the very, very basics of how meiosis works and what the purpose of meiosis is. We'll be getting into the nitty-gritty details of the process of meiosis in a later unit. So this is just very, very big picture. So many organisms do pass their genes to their offspring through sexual reproduction. And this is going to begin with the process of fertilization when two gametes, eggs and sperm, are going to unite to form an embryo. And that embryo is genetically distinct from either parent. The embryo is then going to grow into an adult and pass its genetic info onto its own offspring. Gametes are formed during a process called meiosis. The cells that undergo meiosis to form gametes are called germline cells. Germline cells are diploid, which means they have two copies of each chromosome, one from genetic mom and one from genetic dad. These germline cells are going to undergo meiosis to produce haploid gametes, which are only going to have one copy of each chromosome. And then these haploid gametes are going to fuse, and this is fertilization, and it's going to produce a diploid embryo that grows into an adult. So one other thing that I wanted to bring our attention to has to do with the fact that we said that the germline cells that are producing the gametes, the sperm and eggs, that those germline cells are diploid. And earlier in the video, we said that a diploid cell has two copies of each chromosome, one from the genetic dad and one from the genetic mom. And so this means that for each chromosome, and we can think about, like, humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. So let's think about chromosome number 1. For chromosome number 1, you have two versions of chromosome number 1, one from your genetic mom and one from your genetic dad. And that means that for each gene on chromosome 1, you have two versions, one that came from the mom and one that came from the dad. And the versions of these genes can be the same, or they could be different. So if we're thinking about like one trait that is supposed to be Mendelian, but it's maybe not, but we're just going to use it for this example, has to do with whether your earlobes are detached or not detached. People call them free sometimes. So let's imagine that chromosome 1 has the earlobe gene on it somewhere, and you have one copy of that gene from your mom and one copy of that gene from your dad. So you have earlobe genes from both of them. So let's say that your genetic mom's copy of the gene says that you should have attached earlobes. But your genetic dad's copy of the gene could say that you should have free earlobes or detached. So these different copies of the gene, the one that comes from your genetic mom and the one that comes from your genetic dad, they don't have to be the same. They can be different. So what this all boils down to is this idea of homologous chromosomes. And homologous chromosomes are the same chromosome with the same kinds of genes on them, but they can have different versions of that gene. So when we're thinking about chromosome 1 from your genetic mom and chromosome 1 from your genetic dad, those would be homologous chromosomes. So maybe in this diagram, this is chromosome 1 from your dad in purple and your mom in blue. And then the same thing for chromosome 2. Maybe chromosome 2 has one of the many pigment genes that's going to determine your skin color. And your chromosome from your dad and your chromosome from your mom, they both have the skin color pigment gene on them. So maybe that gene is like right here on this upper arm. So both of those chromosomes have the exact same information. They have the same genes on them. So if we're saying that there's a pigment skin color gene on that chromosome, both of the chromosomes have that gene. And any other gene that's on that chromosome, they have the same ones. So maybe another gene that they both have has to do with whether or not your hair comes to what's called a widow's peak in the middle of your forehead. Maybe that gene is down here. They both have that gene, but they can have different versions of that gene. And the word for this, maybe you remember, is allele. So a gene says what kind of protein it's going to make. So if it's a pigment gene, it's making a pigment protein. And the allele is like the different flavors of that gene that exist. So maybe one of these pigment genes is going to make a lot of melanin, and the other pigment gene is going to make less melanin. So the different varieties of that same pigment gene that exist, those different varieties are called alleles. So what we can say then is that homologous chromosomes are going to have the same genes, but different alleles, or they can have different alleles. It's also entirely possible that they'll have the same alleles. So maybe going back to chromosome 1, maybe both your genetic mom and your genetic dad's copy of the gene, maybe both of them say that you should have free earlobes. So they can be the same, but they can also be different. So here we're showing a picture of a cell that has 3 homologous pairs of chromosomes. So homologous pair number 1, homologous pair number 2, homologous pair number 3. And in this diagram, we're showing genetic dad's chromosome in purple and genetic mom's chromosomes in blue. And this is we're not going to go through the whole process of meiosis, but one thing that we are going to talk about is the fact that these chromosomes are going to line up together before they get separated into the 2 different cells. And this is just the first division in meiosis, but it's where this idea of independent assortment is going to take place. So let's let this video go forward just a little bit. So you can see that the homologous pairs are lining up together. So we have genetic dad's chromosome number 1 over here, genetic mom's over here, and then they've switched places for this chromosome number 2. Genetic dad's chromosome is over here on the left, and genetic mom's chromosome is over on the right. And then they've swapped again for this chromosome number 3. Genetic dad on the right, genetic mom on the left. So when these homologous pairs are pulled apart, which is what's going to happen, so let's see, you can see that they're going to start getting pulled towards opposite ends of the cell. And then when this division happens, where the cell is going to divide into two separate daughter cells, there's some math going on down here that you don't need to worry about yet. So if you imagine the cell is going to divide right down the middle down here, and then this cell is going to end up with two versions of genetic mom. So it's going to have chromosome 1 and 3 from genetic mom and chromosome 2 from genetic dad. And this cell over here is going to end up with chromosome 1 and 3 from genetic mom and chromosome 2 from dad. So that's like a product of the fact of like where those genetic mom and genetic dad chromosomes lined up, like which one was on the left and which one was on the right. And when we were lining up with this first time, it just so happened that those cells were lined up in that order. So going back, we had the right, left, left, right, right, left order like this. But they could have just as easily lined up in a different way. Maybe all of genetic mom's chromosomes lined up on the left and all of genetic dad's chromosomes lined up on the right. In that case, when this cell divides, you would get all of this cell would have ended up with all genetic dad's chromosomes, and this cell would have ended up with all of genetic mom's chromosomes. So the order that the homologous pairs line up, like which chromosome is on the left versus the right of this first division, is going to determine which kind of chromosomes, which alleles the embryo is going to end up with. So if we're making a sperm cell, this sperm cell is going to end up with genetic dad's chromosome 1 and 3. So all of the alleles that go with genetic dad, that's what the sperm cell is going to get for those chromosomes. And it's going to get mom's alleles for chromosome 2. Whereas this sperm cell is going to get genetic mom's alleles for 1 and 3 and genetic dad's alleles for chromosome 2. So the order that these line up is totally random, and they can line up in any order at all. And this idea that the homologous chromosomes can line up in any order is called independent assortment. So what that means is that it's random, and it's not like if genetic mom's chromosome 1 lines up on the left and genetic dad's is on the right, it doesn't mean anything about chromosome 2. Chromosome 2 can line up in the same direction, or it can line up in the opposite direction, and so on and so forth. So just because one chromosome pair lines up in a certain way, every other chromosome pair is free to line up whatever orientation they want to. It's totally not dependent on anything else. So that's this idea of independent assortment. And it means you have when you're making a gamete, there's an equally likely chance of you getting the alleles from genetic mom or genetic dad for any given chromosome. So just because you got genetic mom's alleles for chromosome 1, you could get genetic dad's alleles for chromosome 2, or you could get genetic mom's. It's a 50-50 chance, depending on which side those chromosomes are lining up. So let's let this video play through again. So you're going to see that these chromosomes, these homologous pairs, are going to go to different ends of the cell after this math situation is finished. And then you're going to see we have a bunch of different other orientations that these chromosomes could line up in. So here you see that all of genetic mom's chromosomes lined up over here, and genetic dad's were over here. So when the cell divides, this egg cell, let's say, is going to get all of genetic dad's alleles, and this egg cell is going to get all of genetic mom's alleles. This one lined up in a totally different way. So this egg cell that's going to get these 3 chromosomes gets genetic mom's alleles for chromosome 1, genetic dad's alleles for chromosomes 2 and 3, whereas this egg cell gets genetic dad's alleles for chromosome 1 and genetic mom's alleles for chromosomes 2 and 3. So this idea of independent assortment just says that we can get either version of the homologous chromosome in our final gamete. It can be either the genetic mom's or the genetic dad's for each chromosome, depending on which order they line up in.